In 1943, British engineers handed the Americans a gun that could punch through a Tiger tank's front armour at range. The Americans said no. This video is about why and what happened next. But the American decision wasn't just arrogance. At least, that's not the whole story. To understand what happened, you have to understand the men who made the call. General Gladeon M. Barnes served as the U.S. Army's Chief of Research and Development for Ordnance. His officers evaluated the British 17-pounder at the Shoeburyness proving ground on the bleak Essex coast in early 1943. They watched the demonstrations. They reviewed the technical data. They went home and said the weapon was generally inferior to America's own 90mm gun. That assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. But here's the thing. Barnes and his team weren't idiots. They were working within constraints that, viewed from Washington in 1943, made their decision look almost reasonable. Almost. The American military was fighting a two-ocean war. Every additional ammunition type, every extra spare part, every new maintenance requirement multiplied the complexity of a logistics operation that was already mind-boggling in scope. The 17-pounder fired a completely different round than any American weapon in service. Its 76.2mm shells weren't interchangeable with the American 76mm M1 gun, despite the similar caliber. Establishing a parallel supply chain for British ammunition would have created headaches that rippled all the way back to American factories and ports. And Barnes genuinely believed he had the problem covered. The 90mm M3 gun was America's answer to heavy German armour. On paper, it looked impressive. A muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, capable of penetrating 120 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The M36 Jackson tank destroyer would carry this gun and was already in development. The T-26 heavy tank, later the M26 Pershing, would also mount the 90mm and give American divisions a true heavy tank to match the German Panthers and Tigers. The solution was coming. American ordnance engineers knew exactly when it would arrive. They had charts. They had production schedules. They had everything except one thing. The enemy had not read their timetables. The American evaluation of the 17-pounder also raised genuine technical concerns. The weapon's recoil was substantial. Mounting it in the confined turret of existing tanks created real problems. The British had managed to cram the 17-pounder into a Sherman hull to create the Firefly, but only by eliminating the assistant driver position, relocating the radio to an external armoured box, and accepting a turret so cramped that the loader worked in perpetual contortion. American doctrine emphasized crew comfort and efficiency. A fatigued crew made mistakes. Mistakes in tank combat meant death. The 17-pounder, from the American perspective, represented a significant gun mounted in a way that compromised the human element. There was also an industrial argument that rarely gets discussed. American war production in 1943 had achieved a rhythm. Factories were tooled for specific weapons. Workers were trained on specific processes. The Sherman tank was rolling off assembly lines in Michigan and Ohio in quantities that no other nation could match. Introducing the 17-pounder would have meant either establishing new production lines in the United States, diverting resources and creating delays, or depending on British manufacturing for a critical weapon system. Neither option appealed to General Barnes. Beneath all these rational considerations, there was something else. An institutional culture that resisted external solutions. The Ordnance Department had its own engineers, its own development programs, and its own timeline for solving the armor penetration problem. The 76mm M1 gun was entering production for the Sherman, offering improved performance over the original 75mm. The 90mm was coming. The American system would solve the American problem with American weapons. This wasn't arrogance so much as institutional inertia, the tendency of large organizations to favor internal solutions over external ones, even when the external solution might be superior. All of this added up to a decision that, viewed from General Barnes's office at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, looked defensible in 1943. The problem was what the guns could actually do. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are where the American reasoning falls apart. The standard American tank gun throughout most of the war was the 75mm M3, mounted in the M4 Sherman. This weapon had been adequate against early German tanks, the Panzer III and IV, with their relatively thin armor. By 1943, it was already struggling. The 75mm M3 could penetrate 60mm of rolled, homogeneous armor at 500 meters using standard ammunition. With high-velocity armor-piercing rounds, HVAP, it could manage 90mm at the same range. The catch was that HVAP ammunition was chronically scarce. It used tungsten carbide cores, and tungsten was a strategic material in desperately short supply. In practice, most Sherman crews went into battle with standard AP rounds and little else. Now look at what they were shooting at. The Tiger I had 100mm of frontal armor, 60mm of penetration against 100mm of protection. The math is obvious. An American Sherman with a 75mm gun could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at any practical combat range. The Panther was worse. Its frontal armor measured 80mm, which sounds manageable until you factor in the slope. The Panther's glacis plate was angled at 55 degrees from vertical. That slope gave it an effective thickness against direct fire of 140mm. Not even HVAP rounds could touch it from the front. The improved 76mm M1 gun, which began appearing on Shermans in mid-1944, offered better performance. 100mm of penetration at 500 meters with standard ammunition. This was a meaningful improvement. It could handle a Tiger at closer ranges. It still struggled against the Panther's sloped plate. And it came with its own problems. The 76mm Sherman reached combat units in Normandy beginning in July 1944, and crews initially welcomed it, until they discovered that its high-explosive round was significantly less effective than the 75mm. In the hedgerow fighting that characterized the Normandy campaign, infantry support was often more important than anti-tank capability. Some units actually requested a return to 75mm Shermans. The gun that could better fight tanks was worse at everything else. Now look at what the British had. The 6-pounder gun, which the Americans had actually adopted as the 57mm M1, could penetrate 75mm at 500 meters with standard ammunition. Already superior to the American 75mm. But the 6-pounder had something else, something the Americans didn't have at all. Armor-piercing, discarding sabot ammunition, a PDS. The principle behind APDS was elegant and brutal. A small, dense penetrator made of tungsten carbide was encased in a lightweight outer shell called a sabot. When the round fired, that lightweight sabot allowed the propellant gases to accelerate the whole assembly to velocities that a full-caliber projectile could never reach. The moment the round left the barrel, the sabot sections fell away, and the small tungsten dart continued toward the target at speeds exceeding 3,900 feet per second. Physics did the rest. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. That squared velocity term meant that doubling the speed quadrupled the energy. The APDS round hit German armour with force that conventional ammunition simply couldn't match, concentrated into a penetrator far smaller than the bore diameter of the gun that fired it. British engineers had figured this out by 1944. They were issuing APDS rounds for the 6-pounder that achieved penetration figures of 130 millimeters at 500 meters. A gun that the Americans considered roughly equivalent to their own 75mm was actually capable, with the right ammunition, of defeating armoured vehicles that the 75mm couldn't touch. This wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. British anti-tank gun development had been running ahead of American equivalents for years. The 6-pounder with APDS could penetrate more armour than the American 75mm. The 17-pounder would extend that lead into territory the Americans couldn't match until the war was nearly over. The 17-pounder took the APDS principle even further. With standard armour-piercing shot, the 17-pounder penetrated 140mm of armour at 500 metres. With APDS rounds, that figure rose to over 200mm at the same range. Over 200mm at 500 metres. The 17-pounder could penetrate the frontal armour of a Tiger I at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. It could defeat the heavily sloped glacis plate of a Panther at combat ranges where other Allied guns simply bounced off. The American 90mm M3? The gun that General Barnes said made the 17-pounder unnecessary. It penetrated 120mm at 500 metres. Less than the 17-pounder with standard ammunition. Significantly less than the 17-pounder with APDS. Here's where it gets damning. The 17-pounder was available. The British had been producing them since 1942. The Sherman Firefly, a purpose-built conversion mounting the 17-pounder in a Sherman hull, had been in service with British and Commonwealth units since spring 1944. By the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, British and Canadian armoured divisions each had enough Fireflies to assign one per troop. Every British tank formation had at least some vehicles capable of engaging Panthers and Tigers on equal terms. The Americans had nothing comparable. Their 76mm Shermans were arriving, but hadn't reached full distribution. The M36 Jackson tank destroyer, with its 90mm gun, wouldn't begin reaching units until September 1944. The M26 Pershing remained months away from combat deployment. When American tankers watched British Fireflies knock out Panthers and Tigers that their own guns couldn't scratch, the theoretical arguments about logistics and standardization must have felt very hollow indeed. To understand why the British had this weapon when the Americans didn't, you have to go back to 1942. To a moment of genuine panic. In January 1942, British forces in North Africa encountered something new. Intelligence reports from the desert described a German heavy tank that seemed impervious to existing anti-tank weapons. The Tiger I had arrived. Its 100mm of frontal armour shrugged off everything the British could throw at it. The 2-pounder guns that equipped most British tanks at the time were worse than useless. They might as well have been firing pebbles. The 6-pounder was entering service, but British engineers could already see it wouldn't be enough. Not against this new threat. Not against whatever came next. The response was immediate. The War Office authorized development of a gun that could defeat 150 millimeters of armor at 1,000 meters. Not because such armor existed yet, but because the British were done being caught unprepared. They would build a gun that could kill anything the Germans could field, and anything they might field in the future. That gun became the 17-pounder. The engineering challenge was formidable. A gun capable of that penetration would need to be large, heavy, and generate enormous recoil forces. It would be difficult to transport, awkward to deploy, and a nightmare to mount in existing vehicles. None of that mattered. The British needed a tiger killer, and they needed it fast. Development moved at a pace that peacetime procurement would have considered reckless. By late 1942, the 17-pounder was ready for production. But its purpose-designed carriage, the mounting that would allow it to be towed behind vehicles and deployed as a field anti-tank gun, was nowhere near ready. This is where the British approach diverged completely from American practice. An American Ordnance Department facing this situation would have waited. They would have delayed deployment until the proper carriage was available, ensuring that the weapon entered service in its intended configuration. Quality control, proper procedure, the right way to do things. The British couldn't afford to wait. Tigers were killing their tanks now, so they improvised. The 25-pounder field gun was one of the most common weapons in the British arsenal. It was a field artillery piece designed for indirect fire support, and its carriage was already in mass production across multiple factories. British engineers looked at that carriage, a sturdy wheeled platform designed to absorb recoil and provide a stable firing position, and asked a simple question. Could it be modified to mount the 17-pounder? The answer was yes, with work. The 17-pounder's recoil characteristics were different from the 25-pounders. The forces involved were greater, the stresses on the carriage more severe. But the basic engineering was sound. With modifications, reinforced components here, redesigned mountings there, the 25-pounder carriage could handle the 17-pounder gun. The result was ungainly. The combination was heavier than ideal. The setup represented a compromise that would never have passed American procurement standards, which emphasized purpose-built solutions for every application. It also meant the 17-pounder reached frontline units months earlier than it would have if the British had waited for the proper carriage. This decision puzzles people to this day. Why use the 25-pounder's carriage but not adopt the 25-pounder gun itself? The answer lies in purpose. The 25-pounder was a field artillery piece designed for high-angle fire and explosive shells at area targets. The 17-pounder was an anti-tank weapon designed for flat trajectory fire and armor penetration. Completely different tactical roles. But their carriages, sturdy wheeled platforms designed to absorb recoil and provide stable firing positions, were more interchangeable than their guns. The British, facing urgent need against improving German armour, simply grabbed what was available and made it work. Such an English solution. Practical, inelegant, effective, and utterly baffling to anyone accustomed to weapons designed from scratch for their intended purpose. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was how the British military operated throughout the war. Examples of British improvisation dot the conflict's history, and they reveal a military culture fundamentally different from the American approach. When the Matilda II tank's 2-pounder gun proved inadequate in North Africa, Commonwealth forces mounted the howitzer from the 3-inch artillery piece in modified Matilda hulls, creating the Matilda CS, close support. It wasn't pretty, it worked. When the Churchill tank needed better anti-tank capability, engineers developed the Churchill 7 with a 75mm gun. Not because the 75mm was ideal, but because it could be made to fit. The alternative was waiting for a purpose-built replacement that might take years to develop. The Churchill 7 reached units while the fighting was still happening. The entire Hobart's Funnies programme represented this philosophy taken to its logical extreme. Major General Percy Hobart had been recalled from retirement. He'd been serving as a corporal in the Home Guard when his brother-in-law, Field Marshal Montgomery, intervened, and given command of the 79th Armoured Division with a specific mission: develop specialised armour for the invasion of Europe. Hobart assembled a collection of modified tanks that looked like something from a fever dream. The Sherman Crab mounted a rotating drum on arms extending from the hull's front. From the drum, heavy chains flailed the ground ahead of the tank, detonating mines before the vehicle reached them. The conversion required structural reinforcement, new drive mechanisms, and a completely redesigned relationship between the tank and its forward space. American observers questioned whether it was worth the complexity. British engineers had seen what minefields did to advancing armour, and decided they'd rather have complexity than dead crews. The Churchill Crocodile replaced the Hull machine gun with a flame projector connected to an armoured fuel trailer towed behind the vehicle. The system could project flame over 120 yards and was devastatingly effective against fortified positions. The fuel, a thickened petroleum mixture, clung to whatever it hit and kept burning. German defenders who encountered crocodiles often surrendered rather than face them. Creating this weapon meant accepting the inherent vulnerability of the fuel trailer, the mechanical complexity of the projecting system, and the tactical limitations of towing additional equipment. British engineers accepted all of it because the alternative was infantry dying in frontal assaults against concrete bunkers. The Churchill AVRE, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, mounted a 290mm petard mortar capable of throwing a 40-pound demolition charge at fortifications. The weapon had an effective range of only about 80 yards, which meant the tank had to get close to its target. But a single round could demolish a concrete pillbox. Engineers modified the turret, reinforced the mounting, and trained crews on a weapon that operated nothing like a conventional tank gun. American observers often found these improvisations baffling. Where was the standardization, the quality control, the proper engineering process? The British had learned, through bitter necessity, that the perfect solution tomorrow was worth less than the adequate solution today. Their factories couldn't match American output. Their resources were stretched thin across a global empire fighting for survival. They made do with what they had, and what they had, modified, adapted, improvised, often worked better than it had any right to. The Sherman Firefly was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. The Firefly project owes its existence primarily to one man, Major George Brighty, a Royal Tank Regiment officer who had been pushing for a better armed Sherman since 1943. Brighty had seen what German armour could do. He knew the standard Sherman couldn't answer it, and he refused to accept that the solution was to wait for American engineers to catch up. Working alongside engineers at the Tank Design Department, including the talented W.G.K. Kilbourne at Woolwich Arsenal, Brighty helped force through a project that conventional wisdom said was impossible. The challenge looked insurmountable. Mount a gun designed for a purpose-built anti-tank carriage inside the turret of an American medium tank that had never been intended to carry anything larger than a 75mm weapon. The 17-pounder's recoil was far greater than the Sherman's turret could handle in its original configuration. The gun itself was physically longer than the turret ring could normally accommodate. The ammunition was larger and heavier than the Sherman had been designed to store. Kilbourne and his team attacked each problem individually. The recoil system presented the first major obstacle. The 17-pounder generated forces that would have torn the standard Sherman turret mounting apart. Kilbourne redesigned the recoil mechanism entirely, creating a new system that absorbed the gun's kick within the space available. This wasn't a minor adjustment, it was a complete re-engineering of how the weapon interacted with its mount, requiring new cylinders, new springs, and new calculations for every component involved. Then came the spatial problem. The 17-pounder's breech was too large to fit through the Sherman's turret ring in its normal orientation. Kilbourne's solution was elegant and strange. Rotate the gun 90 degrees. The weapon would sit in the turret, turned on its side, with the recoil cylinders positioned horizontally rather than vertically. This changed how the loader had to work, how the commander observed, how the entire crew interacted with their weapon. But it meant the gun fit. They eliminated the hull machine gun position and the assistant driver's seat to create space for ammunition storage. This reduced the crew from 5 to 4, meaning one fewer man for maintenance, one fewer set of eyes for spotting threats, one fewer person to share the exhausting labour of keeping a tank combat ready. They moved the radio to an armoured box welded onto the rear of the turret, a modification that changed the vehicle's silhouette and created a distinctive visual signature. The commander's hatch had to be modified. The turret bustle extended with additional armour. Every change created new problems that required new solutions. The loader's working conditions bordered on impossible. He wrestled heavy 17-pounder rounds, each weighing over 20 pounds, into the breech while hunched over, unable to stand fully upright, surrounded by equipment that left barely enough room to move. The turret was so cramped that the loader worked with his head tucked between his shoulders, his elbows pinned to his sides, manipulating heavy ammunition through pure muscle memory, because there wasn't room to see what he was doing. American tank designers would have rejected these conditions out of hand. Their doctrine emphasized crew efficiency and comfort as contributors to sustained combat effectiveness. A fatigued crew made mistakes. A cramped crew worked slowly. Everything about the Firefly violated American principles of good tank design. But the Firefly could kill Tigers. At ranges of 1,000 meters and beyond, where German gunners thought they were safe, where standard Shermans could do nothing but watch their rounds bounce off enemy armor, the Firefly's 17-pounder could punch through Tiger frontal plate. It could defeat Panther glacis armor that made every other Allied tank gun in the theatre irrelevant. By the time of the Normandy landings, British and Canadian armoured divisions each had enough Fireflies to assign one per troop, roughly one in every 4 or 5 tanks. This wasn't ideal. Commanders would have preferred Fireflies for everyone, but it meant that every British tank formation had at least some vehicles capable of engaging German heavy armour on equal terms. The Germans learned to recognise the Firefly's distinctive long barrel and prioritise it as a target. That barrel, significantly longer than the standard Sherman's 75mm, was visible at considerable distances. German tank commanders and anti-tank gun crews were briefed to kill Fireflies first. Take out the one vehicle in a British troop that could actually hurt you, and the rest became easy prey. British crews knew they were marked. Some tried to disguise their vehicles, adding camouflage over the barrel, or welding on fake muzzle brakes to make the gun look shorter. Others painted the rear portion of the barrel white to break up its silhouette. None of it worked particularly well. The Firefly drew enemy fire like nothing else on the battlefield. The crews accepted this. They knew what they had. They knew what they could do. In the bocage country of Normandy, Firefly gunners developed tactics suited to their unique capabilities. They let the standard Shermans lead, drawing fire and identifying enemy positions, while the Firefly hung back, protected, hidden, waiting. When a panther or tiger revealed itself, the Firefly engaged from range. One shot. Often, that was all it took. The 17-pounder's accuracy at distance was exceptional. British gunners trained to hit targets at 1,000 meters and beyond, ranges at which most tank combat simply didn't happen. But against German heavy armor, range was survival. Close in, and the Panther's gun could kill you before you got a shot off. Stand off, use the 17-pounder's reach, and suddenly the arithmetic changed. Tank-to-tank engagement data from Normandy shows Fireflies accounting for a disproportionate share of German heavy armor kills. Not because there were more of them, there weren't, but because they were often the only Allied tanks capable of getting the kill at all. When a British armoured troop encountered a Panther, the Firefly was the difference between victory and destruction. The theoretical debates became intensely practical for the American tankers who crossed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, and pushed into the hedgerow country beyond. Almost immediately, they began encountering German armour that their guns could not defeat. Staff Sergeant Lafayette G. Poole commanded an M4 Sherman named In the Mood with the 3rd Armoured Division. He would become one of the most celebrated American tank commanders of the war, credited with destroying over 250 enemy vehicles and killing over 1,000 enemy soldiers before his luck ran out near Münsterbusch in September 1944. Poole was a master tactician who survived through skill, aggression, and an intuitive understanding of terrain. But even Poole's extraordinary abilities couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic. His 75mm gun could not penetrate Panther or Tiger frontal armour at any range. Their 75mm and 88mm guns could destroy his Sherman from 2 kilometers away. Poole survived by flanking, by ambushing, by doing everything except what American tank doctrine said tanks were supposed to do: engage the enemy head-on. The men who tried to fight German heavy armour the way the manuals prescribed ended up as statistics. American tank crews learned very quickly that their 75mm Shermans were death traps against Panthers and Tigers. The German tanks could engage and destroy Shermans at ranges of 1,500 to 2,000 meters, distances at which return fire simply bounced off German frontal armor. The only reliable way to kill a Panther with a 75mm gun was to flank it and shoot into the thinner side armor, a maneuver that was often suicidal in the confined spaces of Norman hedgerow country, where every field was bordered by earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, where sight lines rarely extended more than a few hundred meters, where a concealed Panther could dominate an entire area and methodically destroy any Sherman that tried to approach. American tankers developed tactics of sacrificing 1 or 2 vehicles to attract the Panther's attention, while others maneuvered for side shots. The men in the lead tanks understood what their role was. They understood that their job was to draw fire, to be the target, to buy time for their comrades with their lives if necessary. They went forward anyway. Belton Cooper served as an ordnance officer with the 3rd Armoured Division, the same division where Poole earned his reputation. His memoir documents the maintenance and recovery nightmare that these losses created. The constant flow of burned-out Shermans, the bodies that had to be removed before vehicles could be repaired, the growing desperation of crews who knew they were being sent into unfair fights. Cooper recorded the numbers. The 3rd Armoured Division lost 648 Shermans during the European campaign, more tanks than its entire authorized strength. They received 700 replacements. Some crews went through 3 or 4 vehicles in as many months. The division's maintenance officers became grimly expert at determining whether a knocked-out Sherman's damage was repairable or whether the hull was destined for the scrap pile. They learned to read the burn patterns, the penetration marks, the signs of ammunition detonation. They learned not to look too closely at the interiors of tanks that had brewed up with their crews still inside. The psychological impact was profound. Tank commanders learned to recognize the distinctive silhouette of a panther, the long gun, the sloped armor, the shape that meant death, and the dread that came with it. The exchange ratio varied wildly depending on circumstances. But in head-to-head engagements against Panthers or Tigers, American tank units routinely suffered losses that no rational military planner would have accepted as sustainable. Men wrote letters home describing the sickening feeling of watching their shells spark off German armor, the helplessness of firing round after round and knowing none of them would penetrate, the terror of facing an enemy who could kill you from a range at which you couldn't even hurt him. Meanwhile, British Fireflies one ridge over were killing the same tanks with single shots. The British had figured this out. They had the gun that worked. They had offered to share it. The Americans had said no. The vindication came, as vindication often does, too late to matter. By the time American crews faced massed German armor in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the M36 Jackson had finally arrived in meaningful numbers. Its 90mm gun could kill Panthers and Tigers. American tank destroyers finally had an answer. But the answer had taken 18 months longer than it should have. 18 months during which American tankers died in Shermans armed with guns that couldn't do the job. 18 months during which the British solution sat right there, available, proven in combat, and rejected on principle. The M26 Pershing, America's true heavy tank with its 90mm gun, didn't reach combat units until February 1945. The war in Europe ended 3 months later. The weapon that American Ordnance engineers had promised was coming, the weapon that made the 17-pounder unnecessary, arrived just in time to matter for almost nothing. There's no official record of the US Army Ordnance Department admitting they should have taken the 17-pounder. No formal acknowledgement that the British had been right all along. Institutions don't work that way. The memos that survive emphasize the ultimate arrival of American solutions. The 76mm, the 90mm, the Pershing, as validation of the decision to develop indigenous capability rather than depend on British equipment. The men who actually fought the war knew better. The crews who had watched British Fireflies do what their own tanks couldn't. The commanders who had requested better guns and been told the solution was coming, just wait, be patient. The survivors who remembered the friends they'd lost in Shermans that were outgunned from the day they rolled off the assembly line. The battlefield had already delivered its verdict. Every burned-out Sherman with a 75mm gun, every crew that went into combat knowing their weapon couldn't penetrate enemy armor, every man who died in the hedgerows and forests because American ordnance engineers believed their own solution was just around the corner. They were the cost of institutional inertia. General Barnes had his reasons. They made sense on paper. They made sense in the conference rooms at Aberdeen Proving Ground, where logistics charts mattered more than firing ranges and production schedules outweighed combat reports. But paper doesn't stop an 88mm round. Charts don't deflect incoming fire, and production schedules offer cold comfort to the men in the lead tanks, the ones who drew the short straw and went forward anyway, armed with guns that couldn't save them against an enemy the British had already figured out how to kill. The 17-pounder was the finest anti-tank gun in the Western Allied arsenal. The Americans could have had it. They said no. And by the time they understood what that decision cost, the men who paid the price were already dead. Subscribe for more stories like this.